gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses for their testimony today. And as the discussion has progressed, I notice a theme continues to come up, and that's the benefit of short-term liquidity for consumers provided by these overdraft eligible accounts. And ahead of this hearing, I asked many of my constituents, Kentuckians, for some anecdotes about their experiences with bank accounts and overdraft fees, and I got a whole lot of feedback. And one of them I just have to share. There were a couple of brothers, and they were horse traders. Kentucky is synonymous with horses. And these guys, they would buy Western performance horses for cutting and reining, and they bought them for about $3,000, and they sold them for $5,000. They had short-term liquidity needs, and they sometimes paid the bank $1,000 in overdraft fees and negative balance fees. But they wanted to do it. They knew that they were going to have to do it. They didn't qualify for a line of credit, so they wanted to do this because they had no problem paying a $30 overdraft fee to buy a horse that they would then make $2,000 on. They knew about this product. They liked the product, and the bank had a problem with it, not because the bank didn't believe that these folks were going to pay them back, but because the regulators had a problem with it. That's why the bank had a problem with the overdraft. Another great story from a Kentuckian. And it's one thing to speak about these fees in the abstract, but it's a totally different thing to hear about what happens in reality and to hear it directly. A young mother, husband was deployed in the Army, and the car broke down. She had no way to pay for the car repair, but forgot that she didn't have sufficient funds in her checking account. The overdraft protection on that account allowed her to address her emergency. And she relayed that that fee that she paid was worth the convenience in the circumstance. And I've heard many other stories similar to this one. Professor Zawicki, in a circumstance like the one I just described, what options would be available to that young mother whose husband was deployed overseas? What alternatives would she have if accounts with overdraft protection were banned? What would be the alternative for her as she faced that short-term cash-strapped need?
Well, what we know is that you've asked most people, including people in this room, we would just use a credit card, right? Credit cards that's what credit cards are for. But people who use overdraft are, by definition, they say we don't have credit cards. I think we need to understand, according to CFPB, people who overdraft their accounts frequently have a credit score of 563. 563. These are deep subprime. And so we're talking about overdrafting, extending $300, $500 of credit to someone. These are accounts that go bad. These are overdraft accounts that go bad, which is why you charge a fee on them. And these are people who are not going to get a credit card. So for this young woman, presumably if she had a credit card, she would have used it. She didn't. And so her alternative is probably a payday loan is the best she's going to do at that point, or going without.
And to that point, this woman saw her banker at a grocery store and went up and thanked the banker for the convenience that overdraft protection provided. Professor Zawicki, can you describe the requirements for banks under Regulation E with respect to overdraft fees and the transparency and protections that those rules already provide to customers?
Right. Well, there's already a lot of disclosures that are required with respect to point of sale and ATM overdraft fees. We know they changed the rules so it's opt-in, and so consumers have to actually opt into that. And unsurprisingly, what we see is the consumers who use overdraft protection a lot were a lot more likely to opt in when that was passed because they have the greatest need for the product.
You know, in the final minute, I want to focus on another point that you made and the ability of community banks, small banks, to handle over-regulation of overdraft versus large banks. It's wonderful that we heard from one of our witnesses, Mr. Kundert, about his institution's ability to reduce those fees, and that's the great thing about a competitive marketplace. And presumably because of that move, maybe his institution is able to attract more customers. That's his choice, and that's what the free market and competition does. But can you compare the relative ability of large banks and small banks to absorb the costs of overdraft protection if fees are further curtailed or prohibited?
Yeah, I think it's great that banks are innovating on this. They're competing. If, large banks want to be more generous on overdrafts, that's great. Like, let 1,000 flowers bloom. But the reality is that larger banks have a lot more places they can generate fees from. And so one of the big ones is small banks have continued to be able to be competitive because they offer no annual fee bank accounts, right? Large banks have generally moved away from that. And
Mr. Zawicki, his time has expired. Thank you. And just anecdotes, you reminded me, Mr. Barr, of my daughters buying their cup of coffee at Starbucks, overdrawing $2 and getting charged $35 on their overdraft. So, it goes, they're all over the map on this thing. I'm going to recognize now the gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas.